Hi, this is Carl Gottlieb, screenwriter and author. I'm talking to Rabbi Sol Solomon on Dave's Gone By on UNC Radio.
Oh, shalom, damn it. This is your old pal, Rabbi Sol Solomon. Delighted to be here with a fish story for you. No, I'm not going to be talking about a little fish turning into a big fish. We're going to be talking about a big fish from the beginning that sometimes didn't even work, but they got it to work, and it turned into this multi-million-dollar movie called Jaws that was co-written by the person we have on the telephone with us. His name is Carl Gottlieb. He's written for television shows like All in the Family and Bob Newhart and The Odd Couple. He also co-wrote The Jerk with Steve Martin. He directed that movie Caveman, if you remember that. So, oh boy, we are coming out of our caves to talk delightedly to Carl Gottlieb. Welcome to the Daverhood and Shalom.
Shalom. Bashers, we should be talking.
It is Bashert, and it's lovely to talk to you. So, it's scary to ask an author because they don't necessarily want to say, but what are you working on right now?
Funny you should ask. I just finished a screenplay. It's a musical about vaudeville in 1916 in Australia, about a couple of landsmen from Brooklyn who stowed away on a ship to get work in vaudeville in the British Empire back in the days of the First World War, before America was in the war. And they were taken off the ship in chains in Auckland, New Zealand, because the skipper of the boat on which they stowed away thought they were German spies, when in fact they were Hebrews from New York, as the newspapers of the day referred to them. And of course, the Jewish community of Auckland found them a couple of smart lawyers. They played the piano in the courtroom and convinced the judge they weren't spies, but stowaways looking for work. He allowed them to take a job in local vaudeville, where they killed for the next 2 years, billed as the Stowaways, and that's the name of the musical. It sounds like it should be fun, so if there's any producers out there with checkbooks, contact the rabbi, we'll put us in touch.
Well, but here's the deal. You've written this just because you wanted to. It was not a commission. You're not hired by a studio. You just got intrigued by this true story and wanted to write the screenplay?
Yes, my ex-wife, with whom I'm still partners and friends, it was her Uncle Lou who was the songwriter, and he's the guy who wrote Are You Lonesome Tonight, the Elvis Presley hit.
Oh, my
That
goodness.
was written back in 1922 after his experiences down under.
This is more and more amazing as I hear about it. By the way, what happened? They killed, you said, for like 2 years in vaudeville. Something go bad after that?
No, the whole time that they were in Australia, people kept saying, when are you Yanks coming into the war? Because the Aussies had been fighting since 1914. The Anzacs suffered terrible casualties at Gallipoli, and everybody was looking to America. And Uncle Lou said, look, if America joins the war, I'm going to join the army and protect my family. And sure enough, in 1917, America entered the war, and Lou gave up the beautiful girl with whom he was accompanying and his partner, and signed up for the draft, joined the army, trained as a machine gunner. This is kind of an epilogue.
Yeah.
And then found himself assigned to Camp Upton, Long Island, where Sergeant Irving Berlin was putting together a soldier show.
Oh, my God.
Uncle Lou was a songwriter and a piano player, so he got the job as being piano player for Irving Berlin, who liked his songs and urged him to keep writing and publish. And in 1922, he wrote Are You Lonesome Tonight?
Well, so he had a wonderful life ahead of him. What about the other guy?
We never heard from him again. He was Dutch. He went back to Holland and never turned up in the press again.
Speaking of the Judaism aspect, I'm going to ask, how were you raised? Your name is Gottlieb. I assume you are a member of the tribe, as you said, is Bashert. So, were you Orthodox, Conservadox, Middledox, No-dox, what?
So, practicing atheist, actually. 3 generations of my family declined their Jewish heritage, partly because of the pogroms in Kishinev, where some of my people were from, and others because they were just, opportunists, and never missed an opportunity to pass as Christian. So I was raised essentially with no functioning religion, although I was in a Jewish neighborhood in Washington Heights in New York, where a lot of Jewish refugees settled right after World War II, among them Henry Kissinger.
Oh.
But that was when it was called Frankfurt on the Hudson, because a lot of Ashkenazi German Jews settled there
Mazel Mikveh. So also you mentioned that you have an ex-wife, but are you married again? Did you have children?
Nope, didn't have children. Didn't have an opportunity to raise them in the church. My cousin is quite, with whom I share. My father and my uncle were brothers who were both baptized in Europe and weren't told that they were Jewish until they came to America. They didn't even know. They went to Boy Scout camp as Christians. They went to Christian schools, and then they came to America, and the dad said, "Oh, by the way, you're Jewish." So it came as a surprise to them too. As my accountant once said when I was protesting, I would say, "No, I'm not really Jewish. Technically I'm Jewish because my mother and her mother and her mother, they were Jewish." So my accountant cut right through it. He said, "All right, Hitler walks through the door, sees you. Does he kill you or not?" I had to reluctantly admit, I suppose he'd kill me.
Yeah, you would definitely, He would torture me first and then kill me. You would just kill. So you pass a little bit more than I do, I have to say. But Carl Gottlieb, you're known, of course, as a writer, and you've done some directing as well, but you were performing. As a matter of fact, weren't you part, before anything else, when you went west, to the West Coast, you were on the committee back then. Can you tell us a little about that?
Oh, well, that was my favorite creative experience of all time to this day. I got out of the Army. My friend had already gotten a job as an actor in the company. They needed a stage manager. I got released from military service. I went to San Francisco in 1963. The company had no stage manager. They were working their own lights, and they needed a stage manager. So I became that stage manager, and then a year or two later, I became an actor in the company, and then as an actor, we did very well, and then the company put together a touring show that opened in Los Angeles, where we played successfully for a couple of years. And that's where Tommy Smothers saw me on stage and was looking for new writers for his summer replacement television show, the Summer Brothers Smothers show.
Yeah.
He hired me and Rob Reiner and Steve Martin and Bob Einstein and Lorenzo Music and a guy named Paul Wayne and all kinds of young writers. We all were getting our first break in professional comedy writing. But then we were picked up after the Glenn Campbell show to do the Smothers Brothers primetime show where we won an Emmy.
Well, all right, let's roll it back a little bit because these are the bones of your autobiography or your biography. Let's flesh them in a little bit. So when you were on the committee, what was your favorite skit that you were in or that you came up with?
Well, there's two. One where I was a sportscaster. Howard Hessman and I were two sportscasters, presumably in a booth overlooking the jungle, and we would call a play-by-play of the American involvement in Vietnam. and I think I still remember the opening monologue because it was such a torrent of words. It's, we're high on a hill overlooking a ridge where the 101st Airborne Division tangles for the first time with North Vietnam's crack 7th Regiment. Here comes the HU-1B helicopters of the 101st Airborne settling down. They're laying down a nice base of fire as they hit the ground, and here comes the Vietnamese. They're answering back. I think of landing Solomon, Red. And then Red would say, well, you can tell they're up for this one. Both teams, it's high on undefeated and untied so far this season. You can tell the Americans are excited. They're firing long before they've actually seen anybody. And,
That's very... No, I mean, did you co-write or write that sketch, or was it...
No, I co-wrote it with Howard Hessman.
You wrote it with Howard Hessman? Yeah.
And then in that same edition of the show, we did a version of that. You can still find it on YouTube. Very prescient. Remember, this was 50 years ago.
Sure.
A group of us are lined up on stage, except for one person who's sitting, and we're singing the Star Spangled Banner. It's obviously a sporting event, and everybody is like looking at the guy who's sitting. And at first, they kind of tap him politely and remind him that we're singing the Star Spangled Banner. Then they tap him more aggressively. Then they just start shaking him by the shoulder, say, hey, and by the time we get to the land of the free, home of the brave, we've knocked him out of his chair and kicked him to death.
Whoa. That's rather hilarious, right? I mean, certainly, as you said, it's prescient. Who knew that 50 years later, Donald Trump and the NFL would be fighting over the same thing? But wow.
Exactly. Yeah, and we've been closing. We used that piece to close the show for decades.
Was it funny? I mean, it just sounds really dark.
It's funny because, the group of performers on stage with our finale. So first of all, the audience is pleased because here's the whole cast on stage for what looks like a musical number. Then we start singing a Star Spangled Banner, and occasionally people in the audience would get up, and then they would notice the guy who was sitting, and the ways that we tried to get his attention were comical, and then insistent, and then angry, and then we kind of, crossed the line into mob rage.
Oh, and so Tommy Smothers saw sketches like this that you guys were doing in the committee, and he's like, oh my God, I can put this on CBS TV, right? So I've got to know all these stories about the Smothers Brothers and fighting the censors. So do you have stories, A, about the writer's room of those people that you mentioned who wrote for the show, and also, when you come in and you work and you be so proud of a sketch, and then they come back and say, no, CBS won't, they can't, no.
Yeah, we had that. It was a constant tension between the creative staff and Tommy and what the network used to call program practices, which is essentially the censor. Mason Williams did a piece about it.
Did Tommy Smothers take most of the flack from CBS Brass, or did you ever get involved in any of the fights and the arguments?
The writers were largely insulated from the struggles with the censors. We just would write the sketches, and occasionally we'd throw in some red herrings in the script, some blatantly offensive material, in hopes that the censor would mark that with their pencil and then ignore the joke that we really wanted, which was further down the page.
And did that work?
Occasionally it would work, but eventually they caught on to that. Oh. And then later, as the back and forth about program content escalated, CBS and Tommy, it got to be personal between them until they finally canceled the show.
Yeah.
And then we won the Emmy for Best Comedy Musical Variety for that season.
If only the head of CBS had been Les Moonves, and then anything would have gone. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
So, was that devastating? Because you were on basically a very talked-about hit show. Writers and actors and comedy people tend to be unemployed the moment they're not working. Were you scared after that, or did you go right to something else?
Well, most of us were, young and talented and enthusiastic, and we were used to being out of work and then employed, then unemployed, then employed again. Interestingly enough, because CBS had gotten so outraged that when they canceled the show, we had already been picked up for a fourth season. Somebody prevailed on corporate mercy and said, look, we've picked up the contracts of all these writers. They're guaranteed 13 episodes in the fall, and you've canceled the show. Who's going to make good? Everybody's agent was asking the same question. So, as a gesture, CBS agreed to pay the contractual obligations for the show that they canceled, and they would recoup that if they won the lawsuit. But they didn't. They lost. But in the meantime, while we were looking for work, we had 13 episodes worth of income to kind of cushion the fall. That was enough for all of us. We all survived and went on to other things.
Sure. Now, you went on to write for some of the major shows of 1970s television, including All in the Family. What episode did you write?
I wrote a storyline, which I don't remember, which they used, and I don't remember which storyline that was. It was, something about Meathead and his politics, I'm sure. I'm more proud of episodes that I wrote for Newhart and The Odd Couple.
Oh, which Odd Couple did you do?
I did the one where Oscar almost gets married.
So, when you say you did that, were you the main writer? Were you one of two or three? Yeah.
I was the principal writer of that episode. I pitched it. Later I became, I guess off the strength of that, I became a story editor for the show. I was employed on The Odd Couple on a weekly basis. I guess it was its third season. I left that show to do this movie that my friend Stephen was going to make in Martha's Vineyard. That turned out to be Jaws. And
now, your friend Stephen, how did you know Steven Spielberg? How did you become friends?
Well, we had the same agent, a guy named Mike Medavoy, who's quite a prominent producer and studio head. But at the time, he was a hustling agent for ICM or CAA, I forget, one of that alphabet soup.
Yeah.
He was very big on packaging. He was one of the early agents who saw the synergy of putting clients together. So he took two of his young lads with promise. It was me, who was up-and-coming comedy writer, and Steven Spielberg, who was an up-and-coming television director with a lot of good episodes to his credit, but no major features. And the two of us would go out and try to pitch a feature, and we talked stories. Steven employed me as an actor in a couple of his television movies, just as a day player, doing improvisation, kind of making up my part as we went along. And then I went on to write The Odd Couple. Steven went off and directed The Sugarland Express with Goldie Hawn. That was his first feature. And then when he decided to do his second feature, he asked me if I would be in it first, if I would find a part for myself. And he gave me the script, and I went through it, and I picked a part with a lot of lines. That was the part of Harry Meadows, the publisher of the Amity Gazette town newspaper, who was a co-conspirator covering up the shark attack. So I was employed first as a writer, and then he sent me a copy of the script with a note on the cover saying, "Eviscerate it." So I wrote a long critical memo. I made some mistaken assumptions, and I made one.
Well, what do you mean?
Assumption. I said in my memo, I said, "Oh, come on, do we have to have the teenager who goes swimming nude at the beginning get killed? That's such a horror movie cliche. You have sex, you die." But it turns out to be one of the most effective deaths in the history of horror movies, right up there with Janet Leigh's shower scene in Psycho. So I was very wrong there.
And it wasn't all that. Yeah, I mean, the idea of teenagers getting naked and dying early, and I mean, that really didn't become a cliche up until like the later 70s and the Dead Teenager movies. When you guys did it, it still wasn't that frequent. It was only 1974.
Yeah, but I thought, even then, I thought it was a cliche.
Huh.
I can't tell you what I based maybe some Roger Corman films. I don't know. So anyway, that was a mistake. I said, because I said, "Oh, do we have to just punish people for having sex?" And then paragraph down, I write, "If we do our jobs right, people will feel about going in the ocean the way they felt about taking a shower after Psycho."
And that's what happened.
43 years later, whenever I meet someone, I tell them I was involved in the production of Jaws. They kind of shake their finger at me and said, "Because of you, I didn't go swimming for a year. I didn't go in the water. I didn't go to the beach. I didn't go to the lake." I've heard every variation of, "I didn't even go in the bathtub."
Once you because you didn't do the first draft of the script of adapting the Peter Benchley book, but what did you change and suggest and take away? There was like a love triangle that you said, "Oh no, let's not do this."
Yeah. There was a lot of stuff. Mostly the adaptation of the book into a screenplay, into the finished film, and I was both lucky enough and harassed enough to be on the set, on location, trying to write a few days ahead of the schedule so the actors would have something to say. We discovered very early on that a lot of the stuff that was in the script that had been in the novel was either superfluous or contrary to the on-screen nature of the actors who were portraying the character. I mean, the idea of Hooper cuckolding Brody with the police chief's wife was like, when you saw them on camera, you said, "No, that would never happen." I mean, we wouldn't like him for it. We've cast the wrong actor. It just doesn't play. It was actually in the script the first week of shooting. We hadn't gotten to any of the scenes yet, but that was kind of a holdover from the days when the studio's idea of Hooper was Jan Michael Vincent.
As opposed to Richard Dreyfuss and Roy Scheider playing, yeah.
So we thought, well, they're alone in the boat, they're at sea, they're fighting the shark. Maybe if that sexual tension was there between the police chief and the young oceanographer. And then we said, nah, boy, do we not need that. We got plenty of other fish to fry.
Literally. So it is rather famous that one of the things that Spielberg was most worried about was the mechanical workings of the shark itself. I mean, was there real panic on the set at some point when, for like the fifth time, the thing wouldn't move?
Well, it wasn't panic so much as it was, a deep sense of resignation and what are we going to do until they get the shark working. because nobody doubted that they would get it working. I mean, it was well designed. It had never been tested in salt water. That was one of the problems.
Oh.
And it was very high maintenance actor, much more than any of the others in the show. For everybody else, it became like a job. It was like, okay, you got to go to work. Is the shark working? No. All right, we're going to have to shoot some dialogue. Is that scene in the house at dinner working? Yes. And then we also said, Steve and I were both familiar with a great old 50s horror movie called The Thing.
That was a Corman,
You don't
right?
see The Thing until like 2/3 of the way through the movie.
Yeah.
So we said, okay, let's do that. Let's show how horrible the shark is without showing the shark. So you got that incredible death scene at the top of the movie. You got the two guys, on the dock almost being towed out and eaten, and they escape. The fish and actually biting somebody in the lagoon and at the beach, and those deaths occur for the most part off camera. All the more scary and terrible because of that. In effect, it was kind of a blessing that we didn't have a shark to show, because Stephen had to use every cinematic trick in the book, plus a few that he invented or utilized for the movie, to keep it interesting.
And the rest is literally cinema history. Can I ask, you were friends with Spielberg, you worked on that movie. Did you work on any other films with Steven Spielberg?
Sadly, no. We finished that picture, and he was immediately immersed in writing Close Encounters. While he was doing that, I was anxious to get my comedy chops back, or my comedy cred, because Jaws was horrible.
Sure.
I was lucky enough to do another rewrite, this time for Richard Pryor, a movie he did called Which Way Is Up, where he played a farm worker. It was based on an Italian socialist's movie called The Seduction of Mimi.
Well, Lightning of Wertmüller, of course, yeah.
So it was Richard Pryor remade the Lieber Wertmüller film with himself as Mimi, the laborer who's caught up in this problem.
Well, do you have any Richard Pryor memories or anecdotes?
Well, I knew him in two phases of his life. When we were doing Which Way Is Up, he was as it turns out, bipolar, and he was on the uptick. He was dating actress named Pam Grier, wonderful actress.
Oh.
Foxy Brown. She was Jackie Brown for Quentin Tarantino.
Right.
She was a wonderful actress. She did her share of exploitation, women in cages movies. But
as have I.
As a couple, they were clean and sober, and we went off to Barbados. Richard rented a house for us to write in, and he and Pam would play tennis and jog, and I would make notes, and then they'd come back for dinner, and we'd talk about the script. It was an ideal way to write a movie. And we got the script finished, or rewritten, and then a director named Michael Schultz was aboard. We brought the script back and worked on the script, and there's three parts in the movie, and Richard said, I can do all three of those parts. So he did, and it was a very successful Richard Pryor film. Close Encounters started filming, and I was doing The Jerk with Steve Martin.
Oh, well, and there we have a real classic comedy. It really launched Martin as a movie star. And how much writing was divided between Carl Reiner, you, and Steve Martin? Who did what?
And Michael Elias.
Sorry. Michael Elias, okay.
Michael Elias and I were both performing comics and comedy writers. We both knew Steve from the stand-up days when we all worked in I was in the committee. Steve did nightclubs. Michael Elias had a partner, and they did nightclub comedy. And Michael Elias and his partner went on and created Head of the Class.
Oh, yeah.
A show that starred my friend Howard Hessman after Johnny Fever. So, it's a small world. But in any case, Steve got the writing assignment to write 3 movies for Paramount for himself to star in. Very forward-thinking executive named David Picker made that deal. And Steve asked me, I was, again, friends with a guy named Steven who had a budget for a movie. And he said, do you want to write it with me? And I said, sure. So we sat down and started writing and came up with nothing day after day. And after a week or so, had nothing.
Huh.
Steve Martin's manager said to us, make it about money. Everybody's interested in money. So we said, okay, we'll make it about money. And then another few days went by. And then we were sitting there. We had an office in the writers' building at Paramount. And we'd come in every day, and there'd be poorly, I can always count on this line as a saver. I was born a poor black child. And we both laughed because it's an effective line, especially given Steve's onstage performance as the whitest guy in the world. And then the inspiration struck. Well, what if this white guy was, in fact, born a poor black child? Let's start with my old Kentucky home. Let's start with a shack in the Mississippi Delta where they're singing and playing the blues and doing kind of cliched, darky life. And out of that grew the movie. And then it went to a point, and then I was written out, and there was a power struggle at Paramount. New regime came in. In the meantime, I had directed Steve in a short comedy called Absent-Minded Waiter, which was nominated for an Academy Award. And so Steve's career was going fine, but Barry Diller and Michael Eisner, who had come in to run Paramount with David Picker, didn't want to be in the Steve Martin business. So Steve's management said,
a 3-movie contract.
How about we let you out of that deal? You give us this screenplay and the short subject, and we'll be done. You won't have to deal with Steve Martin at the studio anymore, and we'll find someplace else to go, which they did. They went to Universal, set up The Jerk, and made it, and made a ton of money. Michael Eisner never apologized. Barry Diller, 10 years later, wrote David Picker a letter saying, you were right about Steve Martin.
Really? It took him 10 years to realize that. Amazing. So let me ask, before we move on to other work that you've done, writing movies in the 1970s, especially these comedies that you did, the movies today, people complain about them, they're all just superheroes, they're all special effects. I mean, that's the cavil that people will have. If you were to teach screenwriting to budding 20-something-year-olds, what would you wish that they were still doing now that maybe they're not?
I wish they were still making, good character-driven movies that were not, high-concept prequels or sequels or reboots or franchises. But I understand the studio's fascination with a product that can make $400 million globally, as opposed to a $30 million picture that might only make $180 million globally, which is good for a studio. If you turn out a lot of those, doubles and triples, if you're not swinging for the fences trying to make a home run every time, you can run a very good studio. But they choose to do it the other way. They have corporate overlords they have to be responsible to. It used to be that the whole mid-range of movies that we enjoyed making, there's just no appetite for them anymore.
Not from audiences, but from
production level. Audience will still go see them, and every year, matter of fact, the Motion Picture Academy just invented a new category for successful films because Academy Awards were going to small, good movies that not many people were seeing because that wasn't how they were distributed. 3 billboards in Hibbing, Minnesota, as opposed to Iron Man 2.
Right.
It's tough.
How many people saw Moonlight? That kind of thing. Or even La La Land. I get what you're saying. How much have you been writing and working in movies for the past 10, 20 years?
I never stopped. I wrote a romantic comedy a couple, 3 years ago that in 1980 or 90 would have starred Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. But now, after the turn of the new century in 2010, there was not much of an appetite for it, so it's going to wind up being an independent production.
Okay.
But it's a great little story. It's called The Trunk. A modern young woman, who has yet another disastrous breakup with a boyfriend, throws all the souvenirs of their relationship and every relationship she's ever been into in a trunk, and takes it out to sea and dumps it after writing, "Please do not return," on the trunk, and kind of exorcises her demons, not realizing that the trunk floats all the way to a fishing village where a young fellow pulls it out of the surf. "Please do not" has rubbed off. It just says "return" with an address. So he takes it on himself to figure out who is this mysterious girl and all these clues that are in the trunk. And he finds her, and she mistakes him, of course, for a stalker. He says, "No," he says, I thought you were in danger. I thought people were after your life." And surprise, it ends happily.
Oh, really? Does it? You gave it away. I was all ready to see it, but no, I'm kidding, of course. So we're talking with Carl Gottlieb, who has written many movies. You've done some directing as well, including a film that starred a Beatle.
Yes, somebody reminded me. They said I worked on a music show called Music Scene with David Steinberg, who was a great fan of Groucho Marx, and he got Groucho to do Music Scene. So Groucho was a guest on the show, and we got to write comedy for him.
Yeah.
And then I worked with Ringo Starr and Caveman, and somebody said, "Hey, you've worked with a Marx brother and a Beatle. What does that feel like?"
Well, what does it feel like?
Well, it certainly gives me a unique place in show business history, but one that others occupy. There's other people who've worked with a Beatle and with a Marx brother.
Well, were you a Beatles fan? Did it mean anything to you that 1/4 of the most important, famous pop band in the world was in your movie, the movie that you directed, Caveman? Or was he just, I kind of like the Beatles, it didn't really, he was just an actor for you?
For me, he was an actor. I mean, we needed somebody kind of small and nebbishy to play the lead.
Oh, I could do that.
And you and Dudley Moore and Ringo Starr were the contenders. Dudley Moore was busy, and Ringo Starr was happy to do a lead. And it was a wonderful cast. He was opposite Dennis Quaid, Barbara Bach, who was a former Bond girl. She played the bad girl, and the good girl was played by Shelley Long before Cheers. It was quite a company. And John Matuzak, great football player, played the Nemesis, and Jack Gilford was in it too.
Oh, Jack Gilford! Do you have any Jack Gilford stories?
Jack and Madeline were on location with us in Mexico, and we were shooting at Churubusco Studios. It was Passover. So Madeline had a blacklisted Haggadah left over from Jack's radio days in New York when he was very successful, but got blacklisted and had to, couldn't work for a number of years. So they had a family Seder using this socialist Haggadah, and there we were in a Jewish center somewhere in Polanco, which is the Jewish suburb of Mexico City. And the whole company was there, including, such prominent Jews as Dennis Quaid and linebacker for the Oakland Raiders, John Matuzak.
Well, you could call him for that night John Matuzakowitz, and then it would be okay. Let me ask, I remember Caveman. I haven't seen it in many years. I don't think it was quite a hit. Are there movies that you kind of wish the critics liked more or more audiences went to that you feel if people check them out now on Netflix or wherever, they hold up better than we think they might have?
Well, some do, some don't. Current tastes in movies are so warped. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with Rob Reiner who I worked with in the old days. And Rob said, if I wanted to make A Few Good Men now, with Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise, I couldn't get a green light for that movie. They'd say it was a courtroom drama, too talky. Next. So, when we talk about the changing appetite for movies, there you are. I mean, I have favorite films that are either underrepresented or misunderstood, but over time, people realize that they're good. They're good movies, and sometimes they find an audience. But sometimes you just have to, grab people by the arm and take them to a revival house to see a screening of Harry Met Sally, or A Few Good Men, for that matter. A whole lot of great films in the 70s and 80s.
What is your favorite movie of all time?
I have like a Desert Island 10,
Okay.
10 movies on with me. I don't know if I can go through all of them, but
a couple.
The two Westerns, The Wild Bunch and Magnificent Seven. Casablanca, of course. It's a Wonderful Life. The General with Buster Keaton, wonderful Civil War silent comedy. My favorite black and white of the studio era was a movie called Prisoner of Zenda with Ronald Coleman, David Niven, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Madeline Carroll, Mary Astor, a wonderful film.
Ooh. Didn't they remake that with Peter Sellers at some point? I think they did.
Yes, it was remade. First, there was a shot for shot. It's been remade like 5 times.
Wow.
A couple of times as a silent movie. It was such a powerful novel. Great story hook. It was remade with Farley Granger at MGM in the 50s, and then it was a 2-part Get Smart episode. Took the Carter, and they have the special effects because Ronald Coleman plays two parts, so he meets himself. He has to talk with himself in the movie, and they've achieved that quite successfully. It's a real tearjerker. I love it, and and nobody knows it.
That's the thing. All the other films that you mentioned, I'm thinking, of course, that's basically American Films 101. I mean, you funnily enough, you didn't mention The Godfather. Everybody says The Godfather, or Goodfellas, or maybe Gone with the Wind, or City Lights. But
Godfather 1 and 2 is a pinnacle of filmmaking. That's probably on my top. I mean, Godfather, like Jaws, is one of those movies that when you come across it while you're spinning around the dial, you go, okay, I'll just watch until Sonny gets killed on the causeway, then I'll go back to what I'm doing. And sure enough, an hour and a half, 2 hours later, you watch the whole movie, and you can't wait to see the sequel.
Now, let me ask, is there a screenplay that you've written over the past 30, 40 years now that never got made, but you still feel, oh my God, if that would have been such a great film, and it's been in a drawer forever, or it's been on the desk at Paramount somewhere, in the archives?
Oh yeah, I've got a couple of those. There's a great one I wrote. It would be a great franchise for a limited series on HBO or cable, which didn't exist when I wrote it. Sony owns it. I wrote it as a spec script. They bought it. It was bought by an independent producer who turned around and sold it to Sony as a major film. And for whatever reason, they chose not to make it, but they own it, so it's kind of sitting in a desk somewhere. It's called Wolf and Blood. The elevator pitch is that it's a buddy cop film about a man and a woman detective team who are thrown together in the course of duty, and they each have a guilty secret. He's a werewolf, she's a vampire, and all their lives they've strived to be on the right side. She works at a blood bank as a volunteer, so she doesn't have to kill anybody, and he takes a few sick days every full moon and runs out in the woods and kills coyotes and pests and satisfies his bloodlust that way and comes back to work. Then they discover that the serial killer they're pursuing is from the dark side, and they have an existential dilemma. Do they go to the dark side, which they've resisted all their lives, but that's the only way they're going to catch this guy. So they do the climactic showdown between the werewolf and vampire and this dark force. They win.
Yeah.
Instead of the dark force being thrown from a height onto some, iron railing or burning in a fire, our heroes get to kill him and eat him.
Okay. Was this satirical?
This was done as a serious, comic horror adventure.
Okay, just because it has elements of both, it could go either way there, but we have been enjoying our guest in the neighborhood, Carl Gottlieb. Now, one thing I want to tell you is, first of all, he's got a Facebook page where you can follow his thoughts and what he's up to. It's carl.gottlieb, and then .3, because Facebook has these ridiculous URLs. But he's also got a book, because I asked him a little bit about Jaws and what it was like to write and work on the movie and be in the movie Jaws. But if you want to know a lot more, there's a book called The Jaws Log that he has written that you can go read.
To this day, it's the best-selling book about the making of a movie ever written. It's been in print since 1975. I've done 25th and 30th and 40th anniversary editions of it, and I've managed to update it with new endnotes, so there's more information now in it than there ever was. So for any Jaws-related questions, go get the Jaws Log wherever books are sold. I try to tell people to go to their neighborhood independent bookstore if they can still find one. And even if they have a few bucks more than Amazon, it's supporting your local bookseller. But if not, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold.
Now, speaking of books, the one thing that I forgot to ask you before, since we're talking about a rock star, about Ringo Starr, is that you helped write not one, but two biographies of another rock star, David Crosby. How did that, where did that come from?
Well, back in the 60s when I was working in comedy in San Francisco, there was a go-go bar up the street from our club called the Peppermint Tree, and the house band at the Peppermint Tree playing for go-go dancers in cages was the Byrds. They had recorded their first album, but it hadn't been released, so they were touring as a bar band. And I met Crosby there because Crosby liked what we were doing, and he wanted to be an actor as much as he wanted to be a musician. So we started hanging out and then stayed friends ever since for the next 50, 60 years, including the dark times when he went to jail and was addicted. And I kind of lived through that with him.
Now, you were a big writer in Hollywood working on these major movies. Were you able to stay away from the drugs and all that scene? Did you stay sober and clean, etc.?
Yeah, well, I don't want to overstate my sobriety, but because we all did stuff. But I am what is known in 12-step circles as a normie. I can take it or leave it. So when everybody was getting high, I got high along with everybody else. The illicit substances to be had, I partook. I don't hide that. But at the same time, when I didn't want, if I didn't want to do it, I didn't. So I was never addicted. It was never a problem. So I was able to keep a clear head when Crosby was plummeting downhill and out of control.
And there was no way to help him to say, David, stop. David, you're going to kill yourself. There's just no way to shake them out of it.
There was a fabulous attempt at intervention where Jackson Browne, out of his own pocket, financed a private plane to fly David down to a rehab center in Southern California. A bunch of us gathered at his house in Mill Valley and ambushed him the way you do with an intervention. All his friends tried to tell him to stop, and he said, okay, I'm going, and he stalled unpacking his bag and stalled, and there was no commercial flights available that would get us to the place where he was booked. Had a room waiting for him at the rehab center. Jackson Browne paid for a private plane to fly him down. He checked himself in. His wife went with him. There was a condition that they go through rehab together. And 2 days later, they checked out and hitchhiked back to San Francisco, and it took a jail sentence to get David to clean up later.
Go figure, that was the best thing that ever happened to him. And you wrote the first book with Crosby, and then the sequel, like after he cleaned up and had all the horrible things, and then he did another book with him. Yeah.
Yeah, the first book, I had lived through all the down periods. I went to visit him in Texas. I'm familiar with Huntsville, Texas, which is the prison capital of Texas, where David did his time. And then he got out, clean and sober, married Jan, managed to get herself, with the help of family, sober. They were happily together. Then came as everybody was saying, David, you should write a book. And he asked me would I write it with him. So I said, well, I'm not going to do as told to or with, just let's have equal billing because we're both going to write the book together. But we did, and sold it to Doubleday. In 1988, there was a writer's strike. So although I was co-chair of the negotiating committee, I also lost my job at Universal where I was under contract. So I had plenty of time to work on the book, which I did. I interviewed everybody significant in David's life and collaborated with him, and we wrote a book which is kind of a history of the music business, because David, and the Byrds and Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young was in the Hall of Fame with two different bands, and that's there's very few people who have that distinction.
So many of the people that we've talked about in this interview, everyone from the Reiners to Steven Spielberg to David Crosby, are you still, I'm not saying you go out and have lunch with them once a week, but are you still in touch?
With some of them. Steven is kind of unapproachable. I say in one of the additions to the Jaws log, that although we see each other from time to time, we're both wearing tuxedos and it's some industry function. So I don't see Steven that often. But I see Rob frequently and Crosby a lot.
Cool.
But we're still friends. We wrote the second book because so much happened to Crosby after 1988 that it was worth another book.
He became a daddy, in a surrogate sort of a way. Everybody was shocked about that. Yeah.
Yeah, he had a motorcycle accident and almost killed him. He was in the Northridge quake destroyed his house and everything in it.
Aye.
Talk about 9 lives.
Wow. Well, you have had quite a wonderful life, and hopefully with many more years to come. Carl Gottlieb, it's been joyful and delightful talking to you. Last question for you. Have you ever faced writer's block, and if you did, what did you do?
I know when I'm facing writer's block because I practice avoidance. I will do the dishes 5 times. I'll drive long distances on stupid errands. I'll sleep too late. But eventually, the writing process involves making concentric circles around the typewriter and the keyboard, the screen, until there's no place else left to go, and then you have to sit and write your way through it. So you do. You just keep writing, whether it's laundry lists or emails, or some of my most prolific writing on the web has been while avoiding work or the appearance of work. But eventually you get back to it, and that's why I'm kind of high on this script about vaudeville, because I just finished it, and every writer out there knows that whatever you've just finished is the best thing you've done so far.
Well, this is the best interview that I've ever done so far on the Dave's Gone By Facebook radio program of the stream. We've been talking with Carl Gottlieb. It just remains for me to say thank you so much, and to say keep living and keep writing, and shalom to you.
Shalom.